Hi, welcome to Meaning of Life TV. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and I'm your host today on Culturally Determined. And my guest is Christopher White. Christopher, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm the national correspondent for Crux, which is a U.S. news site that covers the Vatican and the Catholic Church. And I believe we're here to talk about some issues that are kind of pertinent.
Yeah, so the church has been in the news more than usual in the past couple months, and I wanted to, just kind of learn more about what is happening from someone who knows a lot. So thank you for coming on today. So I guess kind of my first question is like, okay, so most people probably know that there's a new, or at least new version of an old scandal that sparked a crisis in the church. I mean, the first that I read about it was the release of this grand jury report in Pennsylvania like a month or two ago, and is that what? And then like more stuff started coming out. So it reminded me a little bit of like what happened at the beginning of MeToo with like Weinstein was the first, and then suddenly all this other stuff started coming out. Like, is that an apt comparison, or are these things not connected?
Yeah, so I would actually go back a little further. I mean, it's been a long summer for the Catholic Church. In late June, the Archdiocese of New York and the Archdiocese of Washington announced that the former Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, had been credibly accused of abusing a minor back in the 1970s while he was still a priest in the Archdiocese of New York. Now, McCarrick, you have to understand, became one of the most important figures in the U.S. Catholic Church in the last quarter of the last century. He traveled the world on behalf of both the U.S. Catholic Church, the Vatican, and also the U.S. government, a major player. And so when these allegations came to light, it sort of unleashed a number of other allegations against him, and we've now had multiple reports spanning 5 decades that this prominent U.S. figure had serially abused seminarians throughout his church career. And that led Pope Francis to accept his resignation from the College of Cardinals, which is nearly unprecedented. There's only one other comparable occasion in all of Catholic history. And so that
the College of Cardinals is the body that elects a new pope when the old pope dies or retires.
Around 120 people around the world, very prestigious. They're often sort of referred to as the princes of the church. So for him to be stripped of that title was rather humiliating. So that was sort of phase one. Phase two has been this Pennsylvania grand jury report that you reference, which is the sort of product of many years of a thorough investigation done by the Attorney General there in Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. And that report, released on August 14th, chronicled 7 decades of abuse by over 1,000 Catholic priests, over 300 Catholic priests, and over 1,000 victims. Now, most of those allegations were historic rather than current new issues. But what it exposed was both, systematic cover-up, which then prompted the U.S. bishops in this country to say they would take a comprehensive look at sex abuse and their handling of it throughout the whole country, and particularly looking at how their policies do or don't effectively hold bishops accountable, not just for abuse, but for cover-up, which is in a sense the next frontier. I mean, back in 2002, when the Boston Globe first did its major reporting on abuse within the church, the bishops adopted what was known as the Dallas Charter. It's global, it's national procedures for the protection of minors. But what we've since found out is that policy, while considered widely effective for protecting minors, didn't actually hold any sort of authority for holding bishops accountable. And so that's what we're left to deal with now. And then I guess the third phase, if I'm not getting too far ahead of ourselves, is just 2 weeks after that report came out, Pope Francis traveled to Ireland for an already previously scheduled visit. And Ireland has been one of the countries in the world that has been most devastated by the Catholic sexual abuse crisis. And so that was already sort of expected to take front and center on this trip. And while Pope Francis was on the ground in Ireland, his former envoy to the United States, Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò, who was, effectively the Pope's ambassador to the U.S. from 2011 or 12 to 2017, released this 11-page testimonial, sort of faulting the Pope for his own for being complicit, he alleged, in the cover-up of Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's behavior over the years, saying that the Pope knew about this and allowed him to exercise active ministry even so. And he, in this wide, rambling 11-page document, he sort of named 36 major churchmen, saying they were all complicit in it as well. Now, it's important to note that document has been the subject of much controversy and questionable veracity. But even so, it fueled this already heated, turbulent debate within the church over sexual abuse. So that's the past 3 months in a nutshell.
Yeah, that was a succinct and very illuminating summary of everything that's happened. That clarified some stuff for me. So, when I guess as someone looking at from the outside who isn't really interested in what's happening in the Catholic Church, but also kind of likes to know what's happening in the world, I didn't pay any attention to this McCarrick story when it first broke. I don't know who the powerful bishops are or cardinals are in the world, so I didn't really pay attention to that. But then the Pennsylvania thing, the grand jury report came out, and that was big news. And then when Viganò, that's how you pronounce it?
Viganò, yeah.
When his letter came out, it seemed like that was a item that immediately became politicized between the conservative Catholic intellectuals and liberal Catholic intellectuals that I pay attention to, where the conservatives were kind of cheering it on because they don't particularly like the reforms that Francis has instituted, and the liberals were casting down on it because they do like those particular reforms. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's very fair to say that the Viganò testimonial has become politicized and weaponized within the varying factions in the Catholic Church. So it's no secret that when Viganò was in the United States, he was very much perceived as an ally of conservative Catholics. And there's a whole sort of litany of things I can go into for that, but I'll spare you that. And most of the folks he named in a critical way in his missive would be seen as fairly progressive types within the church, or if not progressive, at least allies of Francis. And so the criticism here is that the issue of sex abuse, of course, has become sort of a cover to effectively finally get revenge on a pope that many, did not like. Now, whether or not that's a fair analysis, I don't think that's entirely true. I think you do see outrage from both the left and the right within the church over the issue of sexual abuse. But for those within the church that have already found this pope difficult, this has certainly fanned the flames of their outrage to him and given new momentum toward their cause, to be sure.
So one interesting piece I read, which we'll link to, was in a piece that Elizabeth Brunig at the Washington Post wrote. It was an interview with a seminarian who was going on the record for the first time as having been sexually assaulted, I guess we could say, by McCarrick. And it's kind of the way I think this happened in the early 80s, and McCarrick was was in charge of the seminary. And actually, I only realized afterwards that I grew up very, very close to within the Archdiocese of Newark. I grew up in a suburb of Newark, and Seton Hall University is in the small town where I grew up, South Orange, New Jersey. So this was all happening in my backyard without where I had no knowledge of it whatsoever. But it was kind of like the way the seminarian described it 35 years later was like it was an open secret that McCarrick was acting this way, but the young seminarians kind of thought that they had to play along with it or kind of give in somewhat in order to be under his place, like directly under his tutelage, or he would have to directly promote each one from a seminarian to a priest. So it was like just a very large amount of power was in the hands of this one figure, and then there were a number of young men in their 20s who had to like navigate around that. Was this like an extraordinary situation, you think, of this like one predatory person or accused to be predatory, or did this kind of thing happen more often?
Yeah, I mean, if you read the Pennsylvania grand jury report, you will read just gruesome, horrific details of abuse of minors at the hands of priests. I mean, both toward young men and young women. But the McCarrick situation, I think, has gotten so much attention because of the fact that not only was he such a senior churchman in this country and across the world, but by the time he retired as Cardinal Archbishop of Washington in 2006, he had ordained more priests than any bishop in this country. And so his reach was wide, and so many people had sort of come under his, whether it be his tutelage or at least into his orbit, and was influenced by him. And he had a particular way, as you note, of sort of grooming these individuals. I mean, he would ask seminarians to call him Uncle Ted or Uncle Teddy. And we've now seen some of these notes that have been published that he's written them in very personal terms, the sort of language that you wouldn't expect an archbishop to use with a young 20-something-year-old. But it was this real abuse of power that went on for decades, and I think that's why you've seen such outrage on the part of lay Catholics who have said, how the hell did this guy manage to get promotion after promotion after promotion within the church to President Bush, right after he was elected in Washington, his very first public event was he goes over to the Archbishop's house for dinner. He leaves the White House and goes to his house. Huh. It's this sort of deference that, in a sense, the world showed to this guy, and yet no one would dare speak out about what he was doing in private. That I think people have just been so scandalized and hurt by.
Mm-hmm. So this is a minor point, but in the essay that Brunig wrote, the sexual assault happens at McCarrick's beach house at the Jersey Shore, and he kind of like invites. It seems like kind of a regular thing. He invites the seminarians to go and like swim, and the one who was testifying said that he tried to avoid McCarrick as much as possible, but McCarrick kind of forced him to disrobe in front of him, and then later groped him on the beach. And I was just thinking, like, I grew up in this same place, a middle class background. I didn't really know anyone who had a Jersey Shore beach house. Like that just like struck me as a weird detail. And I was like, why, and then I guess in my head, I was thinking like, well, aren't like priests supposed to be like living in poverty essentially and kind of just doing the church stuff and like they give their lives fully to the church. And then I posted this on Twitter. Someone pointed out, priests do not take a vow of poverty, and kind of they make a middle class salary, so it was possible. But I don't know. That was just weird, a weird detail to me that he would have this like luxury that was probably somewhat expensive. And yet,
there are two points to make here. One specifically about this beach house. In 1981 is when McCarrick is made Bishop of Metuchen, New Jersey, and soon after he arrives down there, he convinced the diocesan financial council to buy this sort of, it's described as a fairly modest house, a few blocks from about 5 blocks from the beach, as sort of a retreat house for priests. That's not entirely uncommon for dioceses to own properties that priests can use to get away, or that special sort of spiritual retreats can take place at. So I mean, a request like that probably wouldn't have raised major sort of eyebrows at the time. Looking back, particularly at what happened in that beach house and how he used it, I think people will probably and hopefully ask serious questions when future suggestions like that are raised when a bishop wants to buy property. But what happened in that beach house, of course, was not just that he would lure young seminarians and boys out there. He would often have one of them share the bed with him, and that's where this, much of this abuse happened, was with some young seminarians being forced to share a bed with him. The other thing, though, you talk about the money involved in this. Later on in McCarrick's career, he started what was known as the Papal Foundation. And it was an organization where very wealthy Americans were solicited to give money to, now they pledge to give $100,000 a year for at least a period of 10 years, so effectively at least $1 million to be a member of the Papal Foundation. And this is money that the U.S. bishops have control over, a board of trustees that McCarrick started and he managed during the height of his career. And this money would be used to fund the pet projects of the Pope. And so there are multiple stories of the way in which McCarrick would use this purse string that he held onto to open doors in Rome. So it goes to show you how he, used his popularity to sort of take in funds here stateside and then go to Rome to sort of advance his cause. And of course, they would accept his money. Which, of course, is why many suspect that for years he was able to operate the way he did, and his career just continued to advance.
Yeah. So when the first stories broke in the early 2000s about this, I think a lot of people kind of thought like there were specific things about the Catholic Church that made a situation like this develop. Like it's extremely hierarchical. It's 100% male in its leadership. There's a lot of there's always been like protecting the organization kind of belief, et cetera, et cetera. And then 15, 16 years later, the MeToo stories start coming out, and we see that these type of predatory men were operating in many other areas of our culture. It was apparently an open secret in Hollywood that Harvey Weinstein treated young women badly. But no one was able to challenge him because he was so powerful, and he ran, he was a very successful person in terms of making movies and made a lot of people rich, and, people just kind of ignored his bad behavior. They probably didn't know the full extent of it, but they were, they kind of excused it. That's just Harvey being Harvey. So do you think the church abuse stories are like coming back again? So, I don't know. Do you see that? Is there something about the organization of the Catholic Church that encourages this kind of both behavior and cover-up, or are we finding out that maybe this is just something about human nature and male nature in particular, and there's some percentage of men who want to take advantage of other people, weaker people sexually, and this is like a problem we have to combat in every area of life?
Yeah, I think one of the important things that you've seen take place in the past few months is, as Pope Francis has attempted to address this crisis, not just in the U.S., but of course, other countries, particularly Chile, is dealing with its own sex abuse crisis at the moment, and he's spent a lot of time addressing that particular situation. He's identified that this isn't just about sex, but this is, as you know, deeply and intricately tied to the abuse of power. And the term that he uses a lot is clericalism. And, you can debate the meaning of clericalism and what it entails. But, the main thing for the Pope is that, it's this, his critique is of a culture of, as of men with power, single men, who protect each other and the institution at the expense of victims. And the sort of systematic cover-up that is going on and on for decades. Now, is there something particular about the Catholic Church? After the 2002 revelations in the Boston Globe, John Jay in Manhattan did a major sort of independent external study to sort of like what caused this issue of sexual abuse. And of course, there were a myriad of things that they sort of found. But the major sort of takeaways was that it was, of course, psychological sort of issues with the abusers themselves, and a culture that facilitated this type of cover-up. Now, in recent weeks, you've had a lot of debate over, is it over celibacy, is priestly celibacy, does that contribute or fuel this sort of behavior? Is this a question of the church's of gays in the priesthood? That some want to say this is why they're acting out on minors. Look, I'm no psychologist. I'm just a reporter, so I don't have the answers to those questions. But I think it was an important step for Pope Francis to broaden the conversation beyond just sex abuse, but to also abuse of power, and to connect the dots there, because that's been a missing part of the conversation, really, up until now.
Yeah, that's been a big debate since MeToo broke. Is this about sex? Is this about power, or a combination thereof? And no one really has the answer. But I think probably before it was like in the first iteration of the Catholic Church scandal was probably like, well, these people are perverts. They have this, compulsion to do this thing, and that's really bad. And then like, we'll throw out the bad apples. And now it seems like there's so many times where a powerful man abuses a less powerful woman, and we think it's not just about getting off; it's also about demeaning someone else, exercising power over someone else, etc. So let's talk a little bit more about the letter that Viganò sent. What are people saying? Are people saying like this is likely, this is not likely, some truth, some mistruth, or are there people who are saying like this is just invented out of whole cloth, or what is the current idea on the accuracy of this?
Yeah, I mean the response has of course been varied. So the letter comes out, the Pope is in Ireland, and the next day he leaves to go back to Rome. And as he historically does on the flight back from any of his trips, he holds a press conference. And of course, everyone is just waiting to find out how he's going to respond to the Viganò letter. And the Pope gives an answer that surprised some people, where he says, "I will not say anything about this. I think the letter speaks for itself. You're a journalist, you have the skills at your disposal to see if this actually holds up. And that's the only thing I'll say." And so he's maintained his silence on it since then. Now, some people, defend him on this because they believe that he was ambushed, backed into a corner by those that have an axe to grind. And others, of course, are eager for answers and feel like it, as the leader of a church of 1.3, 1.4 billion Catholics around the globe, something this serious demands answers. In recent weeks, the Vatican has said it would be issuing some clarifications about that letter. What really, at the heart of this letter, is the question over Cardinal Theodore McCarrick and the claim by Archbishop Viganò that in either 2008 or 2009, Pope Benedict implemented sanctions against McCarrick, told him to keep to refrain from exercising public ministry. And of course, McCarrick at that time was a pretty vocal and prominent figure in public life. And Viganò goes on to claim that when Pope Francis was elected, that he lifted those sanctions against McCarrick. I think if you just look at the 5 years that are sort of under the microscope here, you can see that McCarrick kept a very public profile. I mean, the irony, of course, here is that both Pope Benedict and Viganò himself are documented in multiple photographs and videos in public settings with McCarrick during the same time. And on one such occasion, Viganò is awarding McCarrick with a prize in a public location. So I think most people have said these claims of these sanctions don't really hold up. Now, I think what most people are inclined to say happened during that time is that Pope Benedict either directly or indirectly told McCarrick in some sort of private way to keep a low profile, but there was no formal sanctions. So that's the $1 million question at this point is, what did these sanctions look like if they existed? How formal or informal were they? And who knew what and when? But in terms of, canon law, which is, of course, the church's governing law, there was very little Francis seemingly could do to lift those sanctions if they were private. He was probably unaware of them. So.
Right, and there's so the contention is whether Francis was told about, whether like the, folder was opened for Francis so he could see the accusations against McCarrick. Has Benedict spoken publicly on this?
Well, when Viganò first released his letter, one journalist in Rome said that the accounts in that letter had been confirmed by Benedict. And then Archbishop George Ganswein, who is Benedict's sort of personal assistant, has denied that Benedict knew anything about these accounts or would be speaking on that. So most people will say that Benedict has not been involved in this process and will not be involved because he's consistently pledged not to involve himself in the workings of this papacy.
Yeah, so this is kind of an unprecedented situation with, it was very unusual for Benedict to retire or step down and then for him to be a key witness.
That's how odd it is to have a retired pope and a living pope all living on the same 108 acres.
So I think when this story first broke about the letter, I saw at least one person, I can't remember who, on Twitter say, if this is true, Pope Francis has to resign. I don't know. So on Twitter, you can say anything. Is there any talk about something like that?
Well, it's not just Twitter. In the 11-page missive, Viganò himself calls for Francis's resignation, saying it's up to him to be an example to the world on this issue. I think there was, of course, some early chatter of could the Pope survive this if this is true. At this point, I think the letter has been rather, there's enough suspicion over the letter that folks don't see this as a question of whether or not the Pope will resign. The question, of course, though, is this. Pope Francis was elected in 2013 on a reform mandate to clean up the inner workings of the Catholic Church. The number one issue, of course, for the Church to have any moral credibility in public life is whether or not it can protect, minors and get this issue right. And so the issue at hand now is how much credibility does the Pope have on the issue of sex abuse, and will he be able, into however long he has left in his papacy, to actually bring about meaningful reform in this area? And that remains an open question.
Mm-hmm. It seems like the mandate to reform the church. How would you assess whether he's done that or not?
So the mandate to reform was largely, especially in the early months of the Francis papacy, folks thought the reform would be cleaning up the Roman Curia, meaning the bureaucracy of the Vatican. So getting its finances in order, making the Vatican a more transparent place, hopefully bringing in more lay people and women into critical roles of leadership. And on those issues, I think most people said the Pope has pledged and offered, promising words, but there is still reform that needs to take place, and to date, those promises have been unfulfilled. But the reform that I think most people were originally unexpecting, and has certainly been the case, has been the PR reform. In his first year, the Pope, lands on both sort of the cover of Rolling Stone as their, and The Advocate as the person of the year. Just the general wave of popularity and newfound interest in the Pope and by extension the Catholic Church has been a reform in and of itself in some manner. And now he's past the 5-year mark of his papacy, and we've seen those numbers taper off a bit. And so it's a question of how long that reform can last. But there's no doubt about it. This is a Pope that both Catholics and non-Catholics really like, and most politicians in this country would kill to have his approval numbers.
Are people okay? So there were reforms that maybe were expected when Benedict left the papacy that maybe haven't happened. Now that there's another wave of sex abuse allegations, are people calling for reform? Is there any chance there'll be some kind of change that could prevent this, or not?
Well, Pope Francis just last week, in an unprecedented move, said that this February he was calling the head of every bishops' conference around the world to Rome at the end of February to address the global crisis of the protection of minors and vulnerable adults. That in itself has a lot of promise. It is, in a sense, probably the highest stakes gamble of his papacy. Because if he gets this right, he can do what few popes in the past century have been able to do, which is actually properly deal with the issue of sexual abuse within the church. However, if he gets it wrong, then much of everything else he does will be viewed through that light, and it will continue to cast a shadow over the rest of his papacy. Mm-hmm. It's going to be great theater at the very least.
Maybe a final question. Is there any, there's some reforms that liberal Catholics have long wanted that maybe would interact with the sex abuse scandals, things like the ordination of women or letting gay men openly serve in the priesthood. And then there's other things that are like culture war type things like abortion and gay marriage. Is there any chance for some kind of change along those ends, or would it be more like a bureaucratic reform that is that most likely to happen?
Well, just a few months into his papacy, Pope Francis said 5 words, which, in a sense, may be what his most popular slogan today: "Who am I to judge?" When he was asked a question about gay priests in the Catholic Church. Now, some could say, could rightly argue that his expression there has been taken out of context and sort of used as a blanket statement for any moral issue in the Catholic Church today. That's certainly true. In terms of reform on those sort of neuralgic issues, in terms of women, the Pope has said he has commissioned a group to study the possibility of women's being ordained as deacons within the church, not as priests, but as deacons. So we're waiting to hear the results of that.
And what is a deacon?
A deacon cannot sort of celebrate Mass, but a deacon can say, preach at Mass and serve as an elevated ministerial role within the church. But cannot sort of offer the sacraments, sort of confession, Mass, marriage, things like that. So that would, if that were to come to fruition, most people would say, he certainly moved the goalpost for women there. On the issue of, can gay priests openly celebrate, be openly gay? Well, there are many gay priests that are openly gay in this country and around the world. The question, of course, is what do you mean by gay? Most of those that are openly gay would be ones that would say I'm gay, but I'm celibate in my priesthood. And that's actually not a decision really that the Pope weighs in on. That's much more their local bishop or their religious superior if they're a part of an order. On the neuralgic issues, the Pope has been pretty firm on issues of abortion and gay marriage, that these are sort of closed teachings. But what he has been open to is how do we have a more human pastoral response to those in either irregular situations, as he's often sort of termed it, or sort of the messiness of life, as he likes to say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I thank you for coming on today and sharing your knowledge, which is extensive about all these complex matters. So if people are looking for more of your work online, where can they find it?
You should follow us at cruxnow.com, cruxnow.com, and then follow me on Twitter. My handle is at cwhite212, so at cwwhite212.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you again for taking the time. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. And you can subscribe to this show on YouTube, on whatever platform you receive your podcasts on, and lots of other places. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.